Selin, sensing the weight of the moment, raised a hand, silencing the room. "We must proceed with the formalities," he said solemnly. "There is much to be done before the ceremony." Jason's pulse quickened. "Ceremony," he repeated, the words slipping out before he could stop it. Varelia nodded, her eyes softening with maternal warmth. "Yes, the bonding ceremony. It is a sacred ritual among our people. By sharing space with Lyra through the night, you have already initiated the first step. The ceremony itself is merely a formality and affirmation of the bond that has been created." Jason's stomach dropped. This was happening too fast. Too much, too soon. He looked at Lyra again, hoping she would jump in, tell them it was all a big misunderstanding. But she stood there, her skin shimmering with an odd mix of colors: gold, lavender, and faint traces of blue. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that she didn't want to stop it. She wanted this. Before Jason could fully process the implications, Selin gestured to the ship outside. "Come," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "We have brought the necessary ceremonial artifacts. The bonding is a joyous occasion, and we must prepare the space appropriately." Jason's legs felt like they were made of lead as he followed the group outside. The Nerelthian ship loomed large in the parking lot, its iridescent surface glowing faintly under the morning sun. As they approached, the ship's door slid open with a soft hiss, and a ramp extended to the ground. Inside, the ship was even more magnificent than Jason had expected. The interior glowed with soft, ambient light, and the walls seemed to pulse gently, as if the entire structure was alive. Ornate carvings adorned the walls, each one depicting scenes of what Jason assumed were Nerelthian myths or histories. The air was cool, and there was a faint, floral scent that reminded him of jasmine. "Please make yourself comfortable," Selin said, gesturing to a series of low, cushioned seats arranged around a central platform. "We will begin the preparations shortly." Jason sat down, feeling like he had been dropped into some kind of surreal dream. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced with thoughts of escape, of finding a way to explain the misunderstanding without completely offending Lyra and her family. But every time he looked at Lyra, saw the hope and warmth in her eyes, the words stuck in his throat. He didn't want to hurt her. Lyra took a seat beside him, her skin glowing a soft, comforting gold. "Are you all right?" she asked gently, her hand resting lightly on his. Jason forced a smile, though inside he felt like he was free falling. "Yeah," he said, though the word tasted like a lie. "Just trying to wrap my head around all of this." Lyra nodded, her expression understanding. "I know it's overwhelming, but once the ceremony is complete, things will be much clearer. You'll see." Jason wasn't so sure. The preparations for the ceremony were nothing short of breathtaking. Jason watched in a daze as Lyra's family worked together in perfect harmony, arranging intricate symbols on the floor with glowing stones and weaving luminescent fabrics into beautiful, ethereal designs. The air inside the ship seemed to thrum with energy, the very walls pulsing in time with some ancient rhythm that Jason couldn't quite place. It was beautiful and terrifying. As the ceremony began to take shape, Jason found himself drifting into a kind of numb acceptance. There was no escaping this, at least not without causing irreparable harm. And despite the whirlwind of confusion and panic, there was a part of him, buried deep, that was fascinated by it all. The Nerelthians' customs, their rituals, their deep reverence for this bond. It was unlike anything he had ever known. But he wasn't ready. He wasn't ready for this commitment, this lifelong promise that had been thrust upon him without warning. He wasn't ready to become part of an alien family, to embrace a culture he barely understood. And yet, as he sat there, watching Lyra move gracefully among her family, her skin glowing with joy and love, he realized something else. He wasn't ready to let her go either. As the ceremony approached, Jason's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what he was going to do. All he knew was that he was in too deep, and there was no easy way out.
The world outside felt like it was holding its breath. The wind, usually whispering through the trees, had gone still, as if nature itself had sensed the impending danger. My heart raced as Arian's words echoed in my mind, reverberating through the quiet darkness. We had to move now. Arian had already turned on his heel, his long, fluid strides eating up the distance to the edge of my porch. His otherworldly glow had dulled, the luminescence of his skin pulsing weakly like a dying star. I could see the strain in his posture, the way his hands trembled slightly, fingers curling and uncurling in a restless rhythm. Despite his alien appearance, his fear made him heartbreakingly familiar, achingly human. "Where are we going?" I asked, barely keeping the tremor out of my voice. I grabbed a jacket off the hook by the door and slipped into my shoes, the mundanity of the action at odds with the terror pulsing in my veins. Arian paused at the top of the porch steps, his ice-blue eyes meeting mine. There was a flicker of something there, a glimmer of guilt, or perhaps gratitude. "There's a place," he said, his voice taut with urgency. "An old observatory in the hills, abandoned but not forgotten. I've hidden something there, something that can help us." I frowned, confusion breaking through the fog of adrenaline. An observatory, the idea of this alien, a being from a place light years away, hiding in a relic of humanity's curiosity about the stars, seemed almost poetic. But there was no time to dwell on the irony. His words tugged at something deep within me, hope, fragile and small but growing. "Yes," Arian replied, already moving again. "It's not far. We have to hurry." He cast a wary glance over his shoulder, as though expecting shadows to morph into assailants. The paranoia was infectious, sending a shiver down my spine. I grabbed my car keys from the bowl by the door and followed him, my breath clouding in the crisp night air. The car sat like a sleeping beast in the driveway, dew glistening on its windshield. I fumbled with the keys, the cold metal slipping between my fingers before I managed to unlock the doors. Arian slid into the passenger seat with an unnatural grace, his every movement both fluid and tense, like a coiled spring. The cabin light cast harsh shadows on his face, illuminating the gaunt lines of exhaustion. I started the engine, and it roared to life, shattering the fragile quiet. For a moment I half expected to hear the pounding of heavy boots, to see figures emerging from the darkness. But nothing came, only the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, and backed out of the driveway, my mind racing with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. As we sped through the sleeping neighborhood, the tension between us thickened, unspoken and heavy. Streetlights cast fleeting glances into the car, painting Arian's silver skin with stripes of shadow and light. Finally, I couldn't hold back any longer. "Who are they?" I asked, my voice breaking the silence. "These bounty hunters, what are they? What do they want with you?" Arian was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. His hands lay limp in his lap, fingers twitching occasionally, as though haunted by memories of past horrors. Finally, he turned to me, and his eyes were filled with something I couldn't quite name: grief, maybe, or regret. "They are mercenaries," he said quietly. "Hunters without loyalty, driven by profit and the thrill of the chase. They have no planet of their own, only their warships and their code. And they've been hired to capture me, to deliver my life essence to the highest bidder." I tightened my grip on the wheel, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what he was saying. "But why?" I asked, my voice a thread of sound. "Why you?" Arian hesitated, his gaze dropping to his hands. His fingers curled into fists, and I could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of a truth he was reluctant to share. Because he said, his voice low, "My essence holds secrets, knowledge, power that could change the balance of the galaxy." A chill washed over me. It was one thing to know that Arian was an alien, a being from a far-off world, but another thing entirely to understand the implications of his existence. Power that could change the galaxy? It sounded like the plot of a science fiction movie, not something that belonged in the quiet, ordinary life I'd known until now. I wanted to ask more, to dig deeper into the mystery of who he was and what had brought him to my doorstep. But the road ahead curved sharply, and I had to focus, guiding the car up the winding path that led to the hills. Trees loomed on either side, their branches reaching like skeletal hands. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating only a few precious feet at a time. Arian shifted in his seat, his entire body taut with vigilance. "We're close," he murmured, more to himself than to me. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the forest around us. I followed his gaze, though I didn't know what I was looking for. Everything seemed eerily still, the shadows too thick and the silence too deep. My gut twisted with a sense of foreboding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The observatory appeared suddenly, rising out of the darkness like a ghost. It was an old, weathered structure, its domed roof etched with years of neglect. Ivy crept up the stone walls and the front door hung slightly ajar, swaying in the breeze. The place had been abandoned for years, left to decay under the stars it once studied. I parked the car, cutting the engine and plunging us into an oppressive silence. Arian was out of the car before I could even unbuckle my seatbelt, moving with a kind of desperate determination. I followed, heart thudding as I jogged after him. "What are we doing here?" I asked, voice hushed as though the darkness might be listening. I looked around, expecting danger to lunge from every shadow. Arian didn't answer immediately. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a sleek, metallic device. It was no bigger than a deck of cards, but it pulsed with an inner light, casting his face in a ghostly glow. "This," he said, holding it up, "is the stellar shroud. It will cloak my essence, making it impossible for the bounty hunters to track me temporarily, at least." He glanced up at the observatory, his expression dark. "But it needs to be activated here, where the residual energy from the old telescopes can amplify its effect. Otherwise it won't be strong enough." I stared at the device, feeling both a surge of hope and a gnawing worry. And then what I asked: "We hide? Run?" Arian's jaw tightened. "We survive," he said simply. But there was a weariness in his voice, a bone-deep exhaustion that spoke of endless days of running, of never feeling safe. My chest tightened at the thought, at the realization that this wasn't just a single night of terror for him, it was a way of life. Before I could respond, a sudden, piercing sound cut through the air. It was high-pitched, almost mechanical, like the whine of an engine or the screech of metal on metal. Arian's head whipped around, and I saw his eyes widen in alarm. "They're here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Panic surged in my veins. My hands went cold, and I turned in a circle, searching for the source of the noise. The forest seemed to close in around us, every shadow an enemy, every rustle a threat. Arian grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "We have to move," he said urgently. "Inside now." We ran for the observatory, our footsteps echoing off the cracked stone. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as though unseen eyes were tracking our every movement. We reached the door, and Arian shoved it open, pulling me inside. The air was musty, filled with the scent of decay and long-forgotten stardust. The room was cluttered with old equipment, rusted and covered in a thick layer of dust. Arian wasted no time. He placed the stellar shroud on an old metal table and began fiddling with its settings. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, but I could see the strain in his eyes, the way his fingers trembled ever so slightly. "What do?" I asked, feeling useless. The adrenaline was making my hand shake, my mind spinning with fear and disbelief. "Just keep watch," he said, not looking up. "If you see anything at all, tell me." I nodded, though my stomach churned with dread. I moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. My breath fogged the glass, and I wiped it away with the sleeve of my jacket, trying to focus. The forest was silent, unnervingly so, as though the entire world had gone still. And then I saw it. A glint of metal, the briefest flash of something moving through the trees. My throat went dry, and I stumbled back from the window. "They're here," I whispered, my voice breaking. Arian's head snapped up, his expression grim. "Then we have to be ready," he said, his voice steady despite the fear I knew he felt. The stellar shroud hummed to life, casting an ethereal glow across the room. The old observatory seemed to come alive, the walls vibrating with a low, pulsing energy. But would it be enough? As the shadows outside grew darker, and the danger pressed in from all sides, I couldn't shake the feeling that our night was only beginning, and that whatever happened next would change both our lives forever. The room felt alive, thrumming with energy, as the stellar shroud pulsed rhythmically. Its glow painted the observatory walls with swirls of alien light, casting strange, shifting shadows that made the ancient equipment look like hunched sentinels from some forgotten time. My pulse raced, echoing the device's rhythmic hum, and I could feel the sweat collecting at the back of my neck, prickling cold against my skin. Arian stood over the stellar shroud, his hands deftly adjusting its dials and panels. Beads of sweat lined his brow, and his usually serene, almost regal expression was taut with focus. He worked quickly, fingers dancing over the device in a way that made me wonder, Just how many times he had done this before, this desperate attempt to save himself from hunters that never seemed to stop coming. I had seen the flicker of metal outside. It had been fast, but unmistakable. The bounty hunters were close, and a sense of imminent danger wrapped around my chest, squeezing tighter with each passing second. I moved away from the window, pressing my back against the cold, rough stone of the wall, trying to stay out of sight while still feeling every inch as exposed as a bird under a predator's watchful eye. "They're coming," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. Arian looked up at me, and I saw something in his eyes, an emotion I couldn't quite name. It wasn't just fear, there was something deeper there, a resignation tempered by the faintest glimmer of hope. He nodded, lips pressed into a grim line. "The shroud will mask my life essence," he said, "but only if it's fully charged. It needs just a little more time." "Do we have that time?" I asked, trying to swallow the lump of dread in my throat. His silence was answer enough. And then it happened. A sound like a low, rumbling growl resonated from the woods outside. It wasn't an animal's snarl, but something mechanical and cold. It sent shivers crawling up my spine, a reminder that what hunted us was not of this world, not bound by the laws or mercies of nature. I tensed, my hands curling into useless fists as I scanned the darkness beyond the observatory's broken windows. Arian moved closer, his movements lithe but heavy with tension. "They're deploying their drones," he said, his voice tight. "Surveillance and strike units, equipped to locate life essence signatures and incapacitate targets. If the drones pinpoint us, the hunters won't be far behind." "Great," I muttered, forcing myself to breathe evenly. "So how do we stop them?" Arian paused, a shadow of uncertainty crossing his features. "We can't stop them," he admitted. "We can only delay them." But his gaze fell on the remnants of old observatory equipment scattered around the room, some of it ancient, some only a decade out of use. A spark of an idea lit in his eyes, and he turned to me. There might be a way to create interference, disrupt their drones. I followed his gaze, looking at the tangled mess of wires, rusted machinery, and the remnants of telescopes that had once mapped the night sky. My mind churned, struggling to piece together what he might be planning. "You mean, use this old equipment? But it's ancient. Most of it doesn't even work." Arian's mouth curled into a thin, almost desperate smile. "It doesn't have to work perfectly. It just needs to work long enough." I didn't fully understand his plan, but at that moment I was willing to try anything. Together, we scrambled to gather what we could. Arian's long, slender fingers worked quickly, and I followed his instructions as best I could, connecting cables and reconfiguring power sources to cobble together something that resembled a makeshift EMP generator. My hands shook, but I forced them steady, feeling the urgency like a second heartbeat. Suddenly, a whirring noise filled the air, slicing through the quiet like a blade. My breath caught in my throat. I dropped the coil of wire I was holding and rushed to the nearest window, heart hammering in my chest. Out there, cutting through the darkness, were the drones. Sleek, deadly machines that hovered just above the treetops, their metallic bodies gleaming under the thin slivers of moonlight. They moved with a sinister grace, their engines emitting a soft, almost predatory hum. Red lights flickered on their undersides, casting ominous glows that swept across the forest floor as they scanned for any signs of life. I couldn't tear my eyes away from them. The way they moved, like a pack of mechanical wolves, sent ice crawling through my veins. These things were designed for one purpose: to find and capture, and if they found us, we wouldn't stand a chance. Arian's voice pulled me back to the present. "Evan," he called, urgency crackling through his words, "help me with this." I turned, shaking myself out of my horrified trance, and rushed to his side. The makeshift EMP generator was almost complete, a mess of wires and exposed circuits that looked like it would explode at the slightest provocation. Arian was making final adjustments, his expression carved from stone. "Is this going to work?" I asked, unable to keep the doubt from my voice. Arian didn't look at me, his focus absolute. "It has to." Before I could respond, a noise like metal scraping against metal filled the air, a harsh, grating sound that made my stomach lurch. I whipped around to see one of the drones hovering just outside the observatory, its red scanner light sweeping across the room. The beam was like a searchlight, illuminating everything in stark, unflinching clarity. My heart stopped, and I froze, barely daring to breathe. Arian grabbed my arm and pulled me down behind an overturned workbench, both of us crouching in its meager cover. The drone hovered in the doorway, its sleek frame glinting with menace, and for a moment it felt as though time itself had stopped. I could hear Arian's breath, ragged and shallow, and feel the tension radiating off him. The red light swept over our hiding spot, and I clenched my fists so hard that my nails bit into my palms. The air was thick with the smell of rust and dust, and every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, to get as far away from that thing as possible. But we stayed still, waiting, praying. The drone's light lingered for a moment that stretched into eternity. And then, miraculously, it moved on. It drifted back into the shadows, its scanner beam fading as it rejoined the others outside. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, my hands trembling so badly I had to clench them to stop. Arian exhaled slowly, his grip on my arm relaxing. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice low but steady. "They're circling. We need to activate the generator now." I nodded, forcing myself to focus. Arian pressed a final button, and the generator sprang to life with a harsh, crackling sound. A surge of energy rippled through the air, and the old observatory lights flickered as if awakened from a long slumber. Sparks danced across the wires, and the machine began to emit a pulsing, electric hum that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Outside, the effect was immediate. The drones faltered, their movements jerky and disjointed, as though they had suddenly been caught in an invisible net. One of them let out a high-pitched screech, and then it dropped out of the air, crashing to the forest floor in a burst of sparks. Another spun in a wild circle before careening into a tree, its metal frame crumpling with a deafening crash. But not all of them were affected. 2 drones remained in the air, their engines whining in protest, but refusing to give in. They turned their searchlights on the observatory, and I knew they had found us. "Run," Arian said, his voice like steel. He grabbed my hand and we bolted, ducking behind the observatory's crumbling stone walls as the drones opened fire. Laser bolts scorched the air, slicing through ancient wood and shattering glass. The observatory trembled with the onslaught, dust raining down from the rafters. We ran, hearts pounding, weaving through the maze of broken equipment and fallen beams. Arian led the way, his alien grace making him seem almost like a phantom in the chaos. I followed as best I could, tripping over debris but never letting go of his hand. The back of the observatory led to a narrow staircase, one that wound up toward the viewing platform. We burst through the door, emerging into the cold night air. The platform was high, offering a breathtaking but perilous view of the forest below. The sky stretched out above us, a sea of stars that seemed indifferent to our struggle. Arian's chest heaved and he turned to face me, eyes blazing. "We have to jump," he said, pointing to the thick canopy of trees below. His voice was calm, but his hands were trembling. "It's our only chance." My mouth went dry. The drop was dizzying, a sheer fall that would leave us at the mercy of the branches. "Are you insane?" I asked, my voice cracking. "We'll break every bone in our bodies." The door behind us exploded inward, showering us with splinters. The drones had forced their way through, their red lights slicing across the platform. Arian grabbed my face, his fingers cool against my burning skin. "Trust me," he said, his voice fierce. "Please." There was no time to argue. With a final, desperate breath, I nodded. Arian's grip tightened, and together we leaped into the abyss. The world spun around us, a chaotic blur of leaves and wind and the echo of the drone's screeches. Branches lashed at my arms and legs as we fell, the forest catching us in a brutal embrace. Pain exploded across my body, and for a moment, the world went dark. When I opened my eyes, the night sky was a fractured mosaic above me, the stars trembling as if sharing in our terror. Arian lay beside me, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The drone's lights were fading, their engines sputtering in confusion, as the generator's interference did its work. We had survived. For now. But as I lay there, bruised and aching, I knew that the real battle was only just beginning, and that whatever secrets Arian held, whatever power lay within his essence, it was more dangerous and more precious than I had ever imagined. The fall was a blur of chaos and agony, a brutal dance with gravity that left no part of my body untouched. Branches cracked and whipped around us, their gnarled limbs lashing at our faces and tearing at our clothes. My lungs burned, and the world spun in a dizzying whirl of darkness and flickering starlight. Pain roared through my body as we crashed through the underbrush, finally coming to a bone-jarring stop on the forest floor. For a moment I lay there, gasping for air, each breath like fire in my chest. The forest loomed around us, thick with shadows and the scent of pine and damp earth. My vision blurred and then slowly steadied, revealing the tangled mess of leaves and branches above. The night sky was fragmented through the canopy, the stars appearing broken but still fiercely bright, as if watching over our perilous descent. Evanarian's voice was a desperate whisper, and I felt his hand on my arm, warm and trembling. I forced myself to move, to sit up and take stock of the damage. My head spun, but aside from a few cuts and bruises, I seemed to be in one piece. I turned to Arian, whose silver skin was streaked with dirt and blood, his eyes wide and wild with worry. I'm okay, I managed to say, though my voice was hoarse and broken. Relief flickered across his face, but the panic in his eyes didn't fade. He glanced upward, scanning the darkness for any sign of the drones. They had stopped following. The low hum of their engines was gone, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of night birds. The EMP interference must have worked, confusing the drones and forcing them to retreat. We had done it. We had escaped. For a few seconds, neither of us moved, too stunned and too exhausted to process what had just happened. The adrenaline that had driven us was fading, leaving a hollow ache in its wake. Then, as the silence settled around us, something cracked inside me. The terror, the relief, the overwhelming realization that we were alive somehow, impossibly alive, crashed over me in a tidal wave of emotion. Arian turned to me, his ice-blue eyes softening, the fear melting into something else, something more profound. He looked so different now, his usually composed and ethereal appearance marred by dirt and pain, yet he had never seemed more real, more tangible. His breathing was ragged, matching my own, and I could see the vulnerability in his expression, a raw honesty that cut through the chaos of the night. I couldn't stop myself. I didn't want to. My hands moved on instinct, reaching for him, and he closed the distance between us. His arms wrapped around me, strong and trembling, pulling me against his chest. We clung to each other, the world narrowing to the space between us, where the pounding of our hearts was the only sound that mattered. Arian's body was warm, his skin still shimmering faintly despite the grime and blood. I buried my face in his shoulder, inhaling the scent of sweat and earth, and something uniquely him, something alien and yet familiar. His embrace tightened, as if he were afraid to let go, afraid that the world would rip us apart if he did. "We made it," I whispered, the words cracking as they left my throat. My voice wavered, carrying the weight of everything we had survived, the sheer madness of it all. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and I couldn't tell if they were from relief or fear, or something else entirely. "Yes," Arian replied, his voice barely more than a breath. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his gaze searching mine. His hands framed my face, cool fingers brushing away the dirt and tears. "We made it." His eyes shone with a mix of wonder and something deeper, something that made my heart stutter. The tension between us was palpable, an electric charge that refused to dissipate. His face was inches from mine, and I could feel his breath on my skin, warm and unsteady. Time seemed to freeze, the forest around us fading into a blur of shadows and starlight. I didn't know who moved first, but suddenly our lips met, the space between us vanishing in a heartbeat. The kiss was desperate, a collision of relief and need and raw, unfiltered emotion. His mouth was warm and soft, tasting of salt and fear, and the fragile hope that had carried us this far. I felt his hand slide into my hair, holding me close as if I were his lifeline, the one thing tethering him to this world. The kiss deepened, and I poured everything into it, every fear, every moment of panic, every shudder of relief. Arian responded in kind, his own desperation matching mine, and for a moment the universe shrank to just us, two souls clinging to each other in the face of an unfathomable galaxy. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathless, our foreheads resting together. His eyes searched mine, and I saw 1,000 unspoken things: their gratitude, affection, vulnerability, and something like awe. We were both shaking, but not from fear anymore. The connection between us felt fragile and precious, as if acknowledging it too loudly would make it shatter. Evan, he whispered, his voice raw. My name on his lips sent warmth flooding through me, chasing away the cold dread that had gripped me for hours. He hesitated, a rare moment of uncertainty flickering across his face. I smiled, a small, tired smile that felt more genuine than anything I'd experienced in a long time. We're okay, I said, reaching up to brush a stray lock of silver hair from his face. My fingers lingered, marveling at the softness of his skin. We're safe, at least, for now. He nodded, a ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. The fear was still there, lurking at the edges, but for the first time it didn't feel insurmountable. We had fought, we had run, and we had survived. And somehow amidst the chaos, we had found each other. The forest sighed around us, the wind whispering through the leaves, carrying away the echoes of our struggle. The stars above us seemed to twinkle brighter, like silent witnesses to our escape, to our shared moment of solace. We held each other wrapped in a fragile peace, knowing that the world would soon come crashing back in, but determined to savor this one, precious victory. And for now, that was enough. The forest, having just cradled us from a fall that could have ended in tragedy, was now wrapped in a fragile, breathless silence. The embrace that had grounded me in that moment of raw vulnerability was still fresh, but reality was swiftly crashing back in, bringing with it the weight of everything that had happened and everything yet to come. Arian's fingers lingered on mine for a moment longer before he pulled away, reluctantly, his eyes scanning the dark canopy. The serenity of our stolen moment was already fraying, giving way to the urgency and danger that still lurked nearby. He took a deep breath, and when his gaze returned to mine, it was laced with determination. The kiss we had shared remained unspoken between us, a promise without words, but there was no time to dwell on it now. They'll recalibrate, he said, voice low but steady. The EMP disruption won't last forever. We need to keep moving before they adapt. I wiped the sweat and grime from my forehead, nodding even though exhaustion threatened to drag me down. My body ached from the fall, each bruise and cut a painful reminder of how close we had come to losing everything. But adrenaline still coursed through my veins, pushing me onward, refusing to let me rest. Do you have any idea where we should go? I asked, trying to ignore the tightness in my chest. Arian hesitated, a shadow of worry crossing his features. We need to get somewhere defensible. Somewhere with a high-energy source. He turned, his gaze sweeping over the dark forest. The city, he said finally, and his voice wavered ever so slightly. It's our best chance. There's a place I know, an old industrial complex near the power grid. We can use it to our advantage. My stomach twisted. Heading back into the city felt like running straight into the jaws of the enemy, but if Arian believed it was our best option, then I had to trust him. After everything we'd been through, I wasn't going to let doubt or fear slow me down. Okay, I said, my voice firmer than I felt. Lead the way. We set off, moving quickly but cautiously through the underbrush. The forest felt like it was holding its breath, the shadows watching us with an uneasy stillness. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump, but Arian pressed forward, his senses sharp, his focus unbroken. His silver hair caught the dim light, a reminder of the otherworldly being I was now tethered to in this desperate struggle. As we made our way down the hillside, I couldn't help but notice how his exhaustion had deepened, each step a greater effort. His usual grace was marred by the strain of using his energy in our escape, and a pang of worry stabbed through me. Arian, I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady, are you okay? He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was soft, almost vulnerable. Using the EMP generator drained more of my life essence than I anticipated, he admitted, glancing at me. His blue eyes shimmered, reflecting a sadness that made my heart clench. But I'll be fine. I have to be. Something about his quiet determination broke through the wall of fear I had built around myself. I reached out, briefly touching his arm. We'll get through this, I said, and though I wasn't sure if I was trying to reassure him or myself, the words seemed to settle something between us. He gave me a small, grateful smile before we pressed on. The forest gradually gave way to the outskirts of the city, where darkened streets stretched out like veins, carrying the lifeblood of an urban world that was blissfully unaware of the cosmic battle unfolding within its boundaries. Neon lights flickered in the distance, the only color in the otherwise muted landscape. The industrial district loomed ahead, a maze of rusted metal and towering smokestacks that reached for the sky like skeletal fingers. This way, Arian said, his voice strained but resolute. He led me through narrow alleyways and abandoned lots, the silence broken only by the distant hum of streetlights and the occasional drip of water from rusted pipes. The deeper we went, the more the air seemed to crackle with energy, a hum that vibrated just beneath the surface, setting my nerves on edge. The old industrial complex came into view, a massive structure that had long since fallen into disrepair. Broken windows gaped like empty eyes, and the air was thick with the scent of rust and decay. Arian moved with purpose, guiding me inside through a gap in the crumbling wall. The interior was a labyrinth of metal and shadows, but Arian seemed to know exactly where he was going. We climbed a set of rusted stairs that groaned under our weight, emerging onto a wide platform overlooking the main floor. Here, surrounded by rusting machinery and long-forgotten equipment, Arian stopped. He swayed slightly, and I reached out to steady him, my worry deepening. "This place is connected to the city's main power grid," he explained, his voice hoarse. "If I can tap into the energy here, I can create a shield strong enough to hide my essence for a while longer. But it's risky." He met my gaze, the weight of his words pressing down on both of us. "It will leave me vulnerable. I'll need you to protect me." I swallowed hard, the enormity of what he was asking settling like a stone in my stomach. But there was no hesitation in my reply. "I'll protect you," I said, and I meant it. Somehow, despite everything, I had found a strength I didn't know I possessed, a resolve that had been forged in the fires of this impossible night. Arian nodded, and for a moment he looked so tired, so fragile, that I wanted to pull him into my arms and shield him from everything. But there was no time for that. He moved to the center of the platform, sinking to his knees and closing his eyes. His hands splayed out on the cold metal floor, and I watched in awe as a soft, golden light began to radiate from his palms, spreading in delicate waves. The air around us began to shift, thickening with a tangible energy. Sparks danced along the rusted metal, and the ground trembled as Arian channeled the power from the grid. His entire body glowed, his skin a brilliant, ethereal silver, but I could see the toll it was taking on him. Sweat poured down his face, and his jaw clenched with the effort of holding the energy in check. I positioned myself between Arian and the entrance, heart pounding as I scanned the shadows for any sign of movement. The tension was suffocating, and every nerve in my body screamed for me to run, to get as far away from this nightmare as possible. But I stood my ground, determined to keep my promise. Then, the silence shattered. Footsteps echoed through the complex, heavy and deliberate, a rhythm that sent ice down my spine. They were here. The bounty hunters had found us. My breath caught in my throat, and I clenched my fists, wishing I had more than sheer determination to defend us. The first bounty hunter emerged from the darkness, and my heart sank. It was a monstrous figure, clad in armor, that shimmered with a chameleonic, almost fluid quality, bending the light around it. The hunter's helmet obscured its face, but I could see the cold, calculating intelligence in the way it moved. Behind it, more figures followed, each one a deadly shadow. "Step away from him," the lead hunter commanded, its voice distorted and inhuman. "This doesn't have to be painful." I didn't move. "You're not taking him," I said, and though my voice shook, I stood firm. The hunter tilted its head, as if amused, and took a step forward. Arian's light pulsed, growing brighter, and I could feel the energy swirling around us, wild and electric. He was holding on, fighting with everything he had, but he was weakening. I had to buy him more time. "Come any closer," I said, "and you'll regret it." The hunter paused, then laughed, a harsh, metallic sound. "Brave," it said, but foolish. It raised one armored hand, and I braced myself, knowing that whatever came next, I couldn't let them get to Arian. Before the hunter could act, a burst of golden light erupted from Arian, sending a shockwave through the room. The hunters staggered, their armor flickering as the energy disrupted their systems. I felt the impact, the sheer force of Arian's power, and turned to see him crumpled on the floor, his light flickering dangerously. "No," I whispered, fear clawing at my throat. I rushed to his side, dropping to my knees. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked up at me, pain and exhaustion etched across his beautiful, otherworldly features. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. "I don't have much left." Tears blurred my vision, but I refused to give in to despair. "Don't apologize," I said, cupping his face in my hands. "We're not done yet." The hunters were recovering, their movements growing more precise, more menacing. Desperation surged through me, and I knew we needed a miracle. Ariane's light pulsed weakly, and I pressed my forehead to his, drawing strength from the bond we had forged. And then, a miracle happened. The energy Ariane had channeled, the wild golden light that had coursed through the complex, began to gather around us. It wrapped us in a shimmering cocoon, a barrier of pure, radiant power. The hunters hesitated, their armor crackling and sparking as they tried to breach the shield. Ariane's eyes widened, a flicker of hope breaking through his exhaustion. "It's you," he whispered, his gaze locking with mine. "Your energy, you're amplifying it." I didn't understand, but I didn't need to. All I knew was that together we were stronger. The shield pulsed, growing brighter, and the hunters were forced back, their armor failing under the onslaught of our combined power. Ariane's hand found mine, and his grip was strong, a lifeline in the chaos. "Hold on," he whispered, and I did, with everything I had. The light around us flared, a beacon that pushed the darkness away, and the hunters faltered, their advance halted. Finally, with a roar of frustration, they retreated, vanishing into the shadows. The energy barrier around us flickered, then faded, leaving us breathless and trembling but victorious. The complex was silent once more, and the air was heavy with the aftermath of our struggle. I turned to Ariane, and he looked at me with awe and something that felt like love. Without thinking, I pulled him into my arms, holding him as tightly as I dared. His body was warm, and his breath came in ragged gasps, but he was alive. We were alive. Tears spilled down my cheeks, and I didn't care. Ariane pulled back just enough to look at me, his eyes shimmering. He cupped my face, his touch gentle, and before I could say anything, he kissed me. It was a kiss full of relief and gratitude, a kiss that tasted of hope and everything we had fought for. We broke apart, our foreheads touching, and I felt a peace I hadn't known in what felt like forever. "We did it," I whispered, and Ariane smiled, a real, beautiful smile that lit up his tired face. "Yes," he said, his voice soft but steady. "Together." The night was still around us, but in that moment, I knew we had won a precious reprieve. And whatever came next, we would face it side by side.